are today in my backyard at the Main Street Tavern. Alan, how are you?
I'm fine.
Okay,
Welcome.
so we have Alan from the Historical Society. Alan, tell me a little bit about yourself.
My name is Alan Rummerl. I'm the Executive Director of the Historical Society, and I have been here for 29 years now, so I've learned a lot of history.
Yes. So you're not ancient yet, are you?
No.
No, okay.
I'm not
How many
part of-
years do you have
I'm-
to be before you're ancient?
Probably 50 years I'll be in the collection.
Okay. All right. So we'll have a place for you downstairs
That's
as
right.
well. Okay, great. So behind us, we see a lot of bottles. Some of these bottles are from the area, some are not.
Correct.
We're going to start talking a little bit today about farming and how everything started in Keene and the surrounding area. So people started coming over in the early 1700s.
The European settlers came into this area in the late 1720s and into Keene in the 1730s.
Wow, wow. So we've got quite a bit to talk about here in 1/2 hour.
Yes.
So, Alan, tell us where we start.
Mid-1730s in Keene, and
Okay.
the people who were coming to settle in here were all farmers. They were here for agricultural purposes, so they settled along the Ashwellet River and the Connecticut River to get the good fertile land.
Right, so they're really lucky that they had two really strong rivers. Now, where were most of these people coming from?
They came from Massachusetts and
Okay.
Connecticut, so they traveled up the Connecticut River.
So they heard that we had some really great stuff,
Good
farmland
agricultural
going
land,
on.
and they were getting it inexpensively
Yeah.
as well.
Okay, great. So we move from the 1700s to the 1800s. Now, what's happening in the 1800s? Are we starting to bring sheep in yet?
When they first arrived here in the 1700s, they obviously had to clear all of the land, and by 1800, a lot of the land was cleared for agricultural purposes. They'd taken down the trees and removed the rocks, and they had livestock and crops. But in the early 1800s, we began something called the sheep craze in about 1810, when merino sheep were imported from Europe by a fellow named Jarvis from Vermont, and then they spread all over New England because they did well here, so the farmers had another source of income, and of course they'd sell their wool right to the textile mills in Boston and Lowell and throughout this region.
Wow, I can't imagine the energy that was happening at this time with all of the mechanisms, I can't even say it, the machinery that was starting to be used to do all of these things.
In the early 1800s, they really hadn't developed too much machinery yet, so they were still doing this by hand. And for the sheep, they needed lots of pasture land. So that's when our area was almost completely cleared. So from 90% forested when they arrived to 90% cleared for sheep pasture. They cleared out the rocks, built the stone walls, took out all the trees, and had thousands and thousands of sheep. Many more sheep than they had people.
Wow. So now, what did they do with all this wood? Did they use it to build houses, or?
That's a good question. They used it to build their houses and their fences, but they often just burned it or to get it out of the way so they could use the land agriculturally. But then we began to see sawmills and woodenware factories making buckets and pails and doors and windows.
And you
so they
mentioned
were using it.
buckets.
Yes.
My family was a lane.
Lane
So we had
bucket
the lane
mill.
buckets.
That's right.
I didn't even think of that.
Using that wood.
Wow, wow. Okay. So we have a lot of pasture land, and so they decide to do more agriculture now, or besides the sheep?
They continued to do the sheep until about the 1840s when embargoes were lowered, so then we began to import the wool again. So the farmers went back to doing their crops and their livestock, but then by that time they actually had cash crops. So there was enough being produced to send it to Boston to sell to the people in the city. It was more than we needed. And then it was in the later 1800s that they began to specialize in dairy and selling milk.
Okay. So being a farmer is not an easy job. We all know, I mean, we know by having gardens, you know, hoeing and all of this stuff, but these guys did this for their families, for their community. They had huge gardens if they were doing crops, things like that.
Sure, and they did it by hand, so it's hand tools and the use of oxen and horses and
Wow.
pulling plows.
Wow, it's major, really. I mean, think about how hard it was for these people.
They worked from sunup to sundown, from planting time in the spring to the harvest.
Right, and then they had the weather to deal with.
Yes.
So was it 1846?
1816.
Yeah, okay, 1816 was,
The year without a summer.
right, okay, so they had frost right through May, then they had snow in June,
Right.
and July or August?
No,
I
they
think.
had frost in late July, I think it was, and
Yeah.
then they had frost in just about every month, and then a killing frost in late August. So
So they had nothing pretty much that year to feed their
Most of the-
animals, to
that's-
feed them?
That's right. Most of the crops failed, and the corn crop in some towns failed entirely. So they had to try to buy from their neighbors who had put some away, and because they needed this to survive through the winter, to
Right.
feed their families and themselves.
Right, right. It's just amazing. And then there was a year, then they had grasshoppers that came along and decimated everything.
The grasshopper year, yes,
Yeah.
when grasshoppers came in, and not only did they eat the crops, but there were so many of them. They covered the ground. In the morning when you went out, they ate hoe handles, they ate fences, they ate whatever was in the way. So
It's
they're
not
having
like
to,
we have it's hard enough to be able to make all this stuff, but then they have
Right.
all these things. And then a lot of the stuff I'm getting from their website when I went on to look at things that had happened in our history locally. So this is really good. If you want some information, go to Alan's website for the Historical Society.
Correct.
And then there was a huge hurricane that people forget about in the 1800s.
1854, there was a huge hurricane, probably similar to the hurricane of 1938, but we didn't have photography then and good reporting, so people don't remember it as well, but it took down thousands and thousands of trees, killed a lot of cattle, took down fences and ruined barns, so,
Right.
and they didn't have the equipment to get going again as well as we did in the 1930s, so it took them a long time to recover.
Right, and then shooting up to the 1930s. Have we missed anything else that we wanted to talk about between the 1800s and the 1900s?
The reason that they were able to switch to dairy and just doing one thing on the farms is because we now had the railroad in the late 1800s. So they could milk the cows and send the milk in a single day to Boston to be processed and used there, so that it didn't spoil.
Right, so, okay, let's back up just a little bit. The railroads came to Keene in what?
1848.
Okay, so 1848 and 1850, around there is what I sort of learned some information about. I contacted the Historical Society a few years ago, and I got this book by Samuel Wadsworth, and I know this is just one book of many, but it really opened my eyes to all the things that were going on. It has all the names of the families and where they lived and who owned land
Right.
and all kinds of information. And I, again, know that this is not the only book, but this really sparked my interest on all of the things that were happening in the area. And the railroads really did make a huge difference
Oh, definitely.
in bringing things in, again, with the wool, you know, because they were able to transport, but
Right.
being able to transport to the bigger cities.
The milk and then the butter, they could move their butter because it didn't spoil. They could get it there quickly. The railroad made Keene what it is today with the 4 lines going out in 4 different directions. So Keene became the economic center because of that. But the railroad also had an impact on the agriculture in a negative way in this region, because when the rail lines were connected to New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, that produce could come here very cheaply to New York and Boston, and we couldn't sell there as readily anymore. So people began to simply abandon the farms in the hill towns. The
Right.
soil was becoming worn out, but the railroad impacted them negatively, and they simply walked away from their farms in many of
Right.
the hill towns in the northern half of Cheshire County.
Moving into the 1900s, you know, now we have electricity. Things are starting to build up a little bit. There are lots of farms very local to this area. I mean, even when you think about the way Keene is set up, you have Main Street, which I understand they used to bring the sheep down into Main Street when they were, you know, sending them off to
They had
pasture or whatever.
Sheep and cattle drives right through Main Street.
Right,
yes.
right. I mean, you've got to see some of the pictures. It's
Right.
it's really quite amazing. But when you think about Court Street and Washington Street, and then the Surrey Road, and let's see, West Street used to be another name. I can't remember what it used to be called. Do you remember West Street?
There were a variety
A
of
couple,
names
yeah.
for it,
It's really amazing. Again, I got this from the book, and it's been a while since I looked at it. But all of those main roads had farms on them. I remember, you're from Stoddard.
Correct.
And so you remember farming up in the Stoddard area.
Yes.
And I'm from Keene, so I remember the Chase Farm. Always loved honking the horn through the train trestle
Through the-
and
right.
going out and seeing all the cows. My mom used to work at Mackenzie's,
Yes.
which they used to have a parlor where you could watch the cow come through, and they'd milk it, and you know it would move on. And I know a lot of you guys probably don't remember this, but they had roller skates that they would bring the food out to the areas. They had a restaurant and everything, you know,
They
right
had
there
their
for
own
Mackenzie's.
restaurant based
Yeah.
on the dairy and what they produced.
Yeah.
Right.
And then Barrett's had cows out in West Keene, and Knight Farm
Correct.
had cows out in West Keene. And I'm just touching on Keene.
So you could go to all of these farms and buy your own milk. You didn't have to go to the grocery store. You
Right,
could-
and
you
they
could
were
get it right
all
at the dairy.
local. I mean, look at, they're all 5 minutes out of Keene.
Yes.
It's
Right.
amazing.
So in 1885, I think the records tell us there were 2,200 farms in Cheshire County alone.
Wow.
And then when we get into the early 1900s, there are still 400 farms in the 1930s in the county itself. So there were still a lot of commercial farms at that time.
Right. So we also had chicken farmers.
Yes. After,
You know, I really think about dairies as farms, but we had a lot of chicken farmers around the area.
we did. After World War I, that became a specialty for a lot of the farmers. So they would get huge flocks together and sell the eggs and the meat in some cases, the poultry. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. You know, I go down the road a lot of times and I'll see these chicken houses and it just seems so sad, just like these old barns that are falling down.
Right.
But to see the chicken houses and see them there and they have blue tarps on them or they've got the windows boarded up or they're falling in. You know,
Right.
it's sad to think that this was today for them 100 years ago.
Exactly.
You know, I mean, the things that we're doing now are going to be history. We just don't think about it.
No.
No. So now what do we have? We have farms that are starting to pop up locally, but I think we've skipped a whole bunch. Let's go back. So 1900s.
Right. I'd
Okay.
like to talk quickly about the change in the whole structure of dairy and poultry
Yeah.
farming because we began to see fewer and fewer farms, but they were larger farms, and they, with the same number of cows, produced a lot more milk because of the science that was involved now in the milking machines and the electricity that they had to help them out.
Right.
So we had fewer farms, but they were larger and they produced a lot more, and you could ship this material out as well. So mechanization made a big difference.
Right, and so that's what we see now. Like, I know Stonewall Farm has like 40 cows, and I don't know how many some of the other outlying farms have, Manning Hill and some of the other
Some of
places
the
around.
Walpole herds are 150, 200 cows.
Right, right. It is just amazing to think about the numbers still, and that farming is pretty popular, or it's coming back, I think, in a lot of areas. But it's expensive. You know,
Sure.
it's not something that you just do because that's what you want to do. I mean, you have to have skill. You have to know what you're doing. You have to have money to get started.
Yes, the mechanization has helped considerably in the production, but it is expensive too. A lot of these families do this because they've done it for generations and they love it and would not leave the farm. But
Right.
other than that, you really have to invest a lot of money and
Yeah.
be very interested
Yeah,
in doing it.
we've talked with some of the people that are starting to do farms, and a lot of you folks have chickens now, or you know, your backyard farmers, which is great, and that's probably getting closer to what the farms were like when they had 2,200 farmers
Correct.
in the area,
That's
because
right.
they probably had a cow and they probably had chickens and a pig or sheep or
That's right.
whatever. But that was, you know, a lot of little ones, you know, all around.
Right, and then we got just a few large ones, and they were concentrated in those same areas of fertile land, a few in Keene, which are now all gone, but on the Connecticut River especially, Walpole, Chesterfield, Westmoreland. So they have survived up there, but much larger ones. And now we're seeing the smaller ones reappearing, more family farms, and they're specializing in some cases. And we have the CSAs, the Community Supported Agriculture Gardens, but these people can sell at the farmers markets, so they have local markets. And in the 1970s to the 1990s, there was a whole craze in the country on fast food and packaged food, but now people are trying to get away from that.
Right.
And the local farms are more healthy, but also they're better for the environment too, because
Right.
they're not shipping stuff all the way across the country.
Right. And so here we are. We've kind of done full circle because we started there.
Yes.
And we got going. We thought everything had to be fast and quick and expensive. It's all about money. But now we're starting to think about how we can do it and make it continue and be sustainable
Right.
with all of these things by having our own gardens
Yes.
and buying our milk from these farmers that are still continuing to do this kind of thing.
You're right. So
Yeah.
we have come full circle back to where we started.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. It's really amazing because this area has such a focus with the new co-op that's coming in,
Yes.
and really thinking about where our food comes from and what we're eating. Because one of the shows earlier that we did, it was talking about pesticides and things like that, and you know, we just don't think about what we're doing to our bodies. But if you think about what the farmers were like back in the 1900s or before the pesticides started
Right.
to be used, they were pretty much organic,
Yeah.
if you think about it.
Sure.
Because they were using what they had. They weren't using a lot of pesticides. They knew what to do just agriculturally to prevent certain things.
Right.
You know, I don't know what they use exactly, but maybe say vinegar. Vinegar has a lot of different things that it can help prevent. And people get away from these things because they think, well, if I use the medication or the things that they tell me to do, then I can make a difference. So
And they
anyway.
also weren't focusing on the chemical fertilizers before
Right.
1960s, 1970s. And
Right.
they used what they had locally. And in the diaries we have from the 1800s and early 1900s, these guys for weeks in a row, every day, they would be carting manure out to the fields to grow
Right.
their crops.
Right.
They weren't using the chemicals.
Yeah, and I've learned a little bit about like chicken manure and cow manure, and the fact that you do need to mix these kinds of things, and these guys probably knew all this kind of
Right.
stuff. They just knew how to grow. I mean, they probably didn't in the early 1700s when they first got started. They probably had a lot of problems, but
Yes.
yeah, they came a long ways. Yeah, yeah. So, gosh.
So we had all of those dairy farms, and you and I have seen some remnants of some of those in our lifetimes when we would go right to the farm. But even I recall when I was a young boy in the 1960s, probably early 60s, there was an old farmer who used to drive his wagon into Keene, and
Yeah.
he went up and down Main Street every
Yeah.
week. I
Right.
think he came from Surrey. I can't remember his name, but
Yep.
it amazed me as a kid riding
Yep.
in the car to have this wagon going along beside
I
me.
know, because I could never understand. They actually let a guy in a cart drive his horse down Main Street, but I remember the train too, for just a short while. I remember the train coming across Main Street and stopping, and I thought to myself,
Right.
the train is stopping all of this traffic. I can't believe it, but that used to be a normal
Yes.
thing.
That's why they could ship the milk to Boston in one day. It went to the
Yeah.
huge Hood factory right in Boston, and every day it would go through Cheshire County picking up milk. And once a week they had a cattle train that went through as well to pick up cows.
Wow. It's amazing. I hope that the kids that are growing up now will have some kind of an idea about where we come from, because I feel like you and I and people around our age, we're really lucky because we've been able to see a lot of the transition.
Yes.
I love listening to some of the stories that I hear on Cheshire TV about things that have happened in the past, but to really grow up and be there. I wonder what are our kids going to say? In 2012, we did what?
Right.
I mean, it's just, we've gone through so much in such a short amount of time. I mean, we've talked about 300 years in half an hour. I mean, we didn't talk about everything. There's a ton more, but just in the farming,
Right.
they've gone through so much. Yeah.
So we saw those transitions, but the kids today don't have those in many cases, especially in places like Keene, where the
But they'll
commercial
know
farms are gone.
they'll know when they had their new iPads and when Apple came out with a new product and things
But
like
they
that.
don't realize where the milk comes from
Right.
that's sitting on the shelf in the grocery store.
Right.
That's why operations such as Stonewall Farm are important, because they actually show how that all works.
Right, right. Because, I think a lot of people have no idea. I like to go to Pete's vegetable stand up in Walpole.
Yes.
Because that's like,
From the
the
garden
way it
right
used to be. Right. Or Green Wagon or any of these places that are producing vegetables locally, and they're right here in my backyard.
Right.
Yeah, so. Well, tell me just quickly a little bit about the Historic Society.
The Historical Society of Cheshire County is now 85 years old. We have hundreds of thousands of items of local interest here that we've collected over those years, so we do lots of educational programming based on those collections. We did 140 public programs last year. We have the Wyman Tavern Period House, which is a 1762 tavern, 250 years old this year. That's why we're in the Main Street Tavern here. And we have a research library that people come from all over the country to do research on their families and on local history. So it's a very active operation here.
Well, it's a beautiful building. It's on Lower Main Street, and I hope you'll take a chance and drive down. And now your hours are what?
We're open Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday from 9 to 4. On Wednesdays, we're here from 9 until 9 at night, and Saturday mornings from 9 to noon.
Yeah. So your schedule's pretty open for people if they're
Yes.
interested in coming down.
That's right.
And now you have different shows that will come in. You'll have different displays.
Right. We do 2 feature exhibits a year in this exhibit hall. The next one is on water power mills. So maybe we should do another
I
show
would
on
love that because I just find that so interesting. We did a show on Harrisville,
Yes.
and it's amazing to see what they used to do, and that was the way it was. They didn't think I mean, that's all they had. But
right.
to see the water power, and I mean, we could do a show on Colony Mill. I mean,
Yes.
when you look at the area by the Ashwillet River Park, that was all water. You know, or
That was the
I don't know
mill
if you remember
pond.
when Grand Union used to be there.
Oh, yes.
Yes, but I mean, that was all parking lot too. But that was all, that whole parking lot there was all water.
Correct. My parents used to talk about skating there on the mill pond. So, and they filled it in the early 50s to build the Grand Union.
Yeah, yeah. We've got so much to talk about. So, but anyway, our topic today has been farming. But it is just really amazing to see all of the transitions just in our lifetime.
Yes.
But to think back that it started happening in the 1700s and to see where we're at now, and that we are starting to look back at how good they really had it
Right.
back then. Yeah.
Yes.
It's great. Good. Well, thank you, Alan.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah.
And today we've been in my backyard at the Historical Society in Cheshire County. If you have any questions or would like more information about this program or other programs, or you'd like to be a guest, you can email us at inmybackyardch8@gmail.com, and we'll get back to you. So thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you again in my backyard.